The wind screamed down from the mountains like it wanted to peel the land bare. Snow tore sideways across the flats, and the men who mocked her didn't dare leave their cabins. But the widow's fire never even flickered. They mocked her the first day she dragged the scrap wood behind her mule. It wasn't even proper lumber, mostly warped pine slats, salvage from a barn that had blown apart the winter before. Stacked in a wheelbarrow she pushed alone, two kids trailing behind her like ducklings through snow-muddied grass. "Where's she going? To patch up the side of a rock?" laughed Wes Corbin from his front porch, chaw leaking down his stubble. "Must be making a chicken coop for the wind," others joined in. They always did when it came to her. She didn't have a husband anymore. Only a 5-year-old girl who still whispered to the wind, and a boy of 9 who never spoke since the day their father died in the river. And she had that boulder, a monstrous slab of rock, black and slanted like a wall, half buried in the earth at the edge of her land. It was older than any of the cabins. Some thought it part of a long dead hill, sheared by time or storm, or some ancient crack in the earth. To her, it was something else entirely. It was shelter. They hadn't seen her weeks before, when the first chill crept in, when she sat cross-legged in the grass, tracing her fingers along the wind's path, tying strips of cloth to willow branches, and watching which way they twisted. They hadn't seen her when she stood still as a fence post in the dead of night, measuring where the frost refused to form along the back of that boulder. They hadn't seen her mark out a perfect arc, tracing it with a burnt stick against the rock like some kind of ritual. All they saw was a widow building a shed where no one in their right mind would. Too small to live in, too strange to heat, and pinned against that boulder like it was hiding something shameful. "You want to live inside a damn shadow?" one man scoffed when she came to trade. She said nothing, bought salt and oats, didn't even haggle. By the time the walls were up, she'd used every inch of scrap, every nail she could straighten by hand, and a doorframe made from an old bunk bed someone tossed out. The roof she laid low and flat, barely tilted. Windows, none. Inside, it was barely 8 feet across. She dug down through clay and stone with a pickaxe for the floor, so deep that when her children walked in, their heads nearly vanished from view. "Looks like a grave mourner home," Wes muttered. But when she lit her stove, an iron barrel with a chimney pipe jammed through a crack in the rock, the smoke didn't curl. It vanished straight upward, tucked in the crook of the windless seam behind the boulder. The first freeze came early that year. Wind howled from the north, storms smashed across the valley, snow stacked sideways on cabins until doors stuck shut and windows grew frosted shut from inside. Men cursed the seams in their roofs, wives stuffed cloth in the floorboards, chimneys coughed back soot because the wind shoved too hard down the flues. But in the widow's strange little shed, the silence was uncanny. Snow never drifted at her door. The wind rushed past but never touched the space tucked against the rock. Her firewood pile stayed dry, her chimney stayed clear, her children didn't wake up cold. It was Annie Merrill's boy who saw it first. He'd wandered too far after the storm, looking for the dog, and got caught behind her property when his foot slipped in a rut of ice. He thought he'd scream. The wind was so strong he could hardly breathe, and the frostbite was starting to bite through his gloves. Then he heard it. Laughter, not cruel laughter, not teasing, children's laughter, warm and bright and impossible in the storm. He crawled toward it. There, wedged behind that impossible boulder, was a shed so squat and strange it looked like it had been folded into the land by accident. A flicker of orange light came from under the door. No snow piled near the base. The wind bent sideways around it like it was afraid to touch the thing. The door opened before he could knock. She didn't say anything, just pulled him inside, stripped his gloves, and buried his hands in a pot of warm water while her daughter brought a blanket that smelled like cedar. Inside, it was still, warm as spring. After that, no one mocked her aloud anymore, but they still whispered, "She's got some trick, that rock's cursed. Maybe she found a cave under it, like the old folk tales. I heard she keeps the wind out by burning sage and chanting prayers." Men hated what they couldn't understand, especially when it made them look foolish. Wes Corbin said it was just luck, that she'd buried the shed too deep and it had rot out from underneath come thaw. But when he tried to copy it, cleared a patch near a smaller stone, built a lean-to with his brother's help, it collapsed under its own snowpack in 2 weeks. The wind never spared him. 2 weeks later, the wind came harder than it had in years. Gusts tore trees down, smashed windows, unseated whole sections of roof from cabins built with proud hands and straight lines. Temperatures dropped to 15 below. Chimneys froze over with ice. Livestock died in barns before morning. The widow's shed never even creaked, and for the first time, someone knocked on her door. It was Wes Corbin. His hand was purple from cold, his eyes red. He held his boy under one arm, his boots wrapped in a horse blanket. She didn't say anything. just opened the door. There was no pride in it, no smile, no smugness, only warmth and silence. But some in town didn't like that. A woman alone, outsmarting them with nothing but her eyes, her instinct, and a hunk of ancient rock. They didn't like that one bit, not when others started asking her to teach them, not when she refused, because some secrets weren't meant to be shared, not yet, and not with everyone. The wind that struck that winter was remembered in valley stories for decades. Some said it howled so loud it cracked windows from the inside. Others swore it killed more than wolves did that season. Roofs vanished in the night, trees split in half like struck matches, whole fences flattened as if stomped by giants. The widow's shed never moved, but the trouble didn't start with the wind. It started with the neighbors. By the second blizzard, 2 more families had sent their children to sleep in her strange dug-in home. Mrs. Holcomb, a woman who'd once refused to even look the widow in the eye, now stood on her doorstep with frostbitten fingers wrapped in rags, cradling her infant like she might vanish with the cold. The widow didn't speak, she just stepped aside. Inside, the fire always burned low but steady. That old iron barrel of a stove, more rust than shape, gave off a warmth that seemed too generous for its size. A single bundle of sticks could last the day. The rock behind it radiated heat like a hearthstone. The boulder trapped it, kept it close, held the wind at bay so fully that some children forgot it existed outside. But not everyone saw the miracle. Some saw a threat. It was Amos Trigg who first started talking out loud. He hadn't built his cabin wrong. He hadn't ignored the wind. He, like many men in the valley, had simply underestimated the land. But he needed someone to blame. "You all forget who she is," Amos told a crowd in the general store one bitter morning. "She ain't from here. Her man died in our river, and now she builds that." He jabbed a finger toward the north window. "And acts like it's God's gift to the cold? She's got women begging her for space," someone muttered. "Taking in our children," another added, "like she's some frontier queen." "She won't teach nobody how she did it," Amos said. "And y'all don't find that strange?" Truth was, she had taught someone. An old couple from the eastern slope, 2 miles out. She'd shown where the wind curved and where to dig. They'd come back with their cheeks pink and eyes full of grateful tears. But she refused Amos, and men like him don't forget slights. It was Wes Corbin who came to warn her. He'd stayed silent the first time, out of shame. He wasn't proud he'd once laughed at her. But now he stood at the edge of her property, hat in hand, boots sunk in snow up to his shins. "They're angry you didn't share," he said quietly, "and that you survived." The widow said nothing. She chopped wood as he spoke, the axe striking with a rhythm that dared him to interrupt. "I told them they're fools. But Amos? He wants proof. Says you're hiding something in that shed. Witchcraft or worse." She glanced up at that. Just a flick of the eyes. No fear in them. Only tiredness. "Then let him come," she said. They came 2 nights later. 3 men, their faces wrapped in scarves, shoulders hunched against the cold. Amos carried a lantern. The others carried shovels. They didn't knock. They walked past the front of the shed and began to dig. "This ain't about hurting her," Amos said, mostly to himself. "This is about truth." Snow scraped, dirt cracked. They pounded around the base of the boulder, like they expected it to rise and reveal a stairwell to hell. They didn't notice the child inside, watching them from behind a curtain of stitched burlap. They didn't know Wes stood just beyond the trees, fists clenched. When the avalanche hit, it wasn't snow, it was wind, a sudden gust off the ridge, coiled and brutal, like a whip crack of air. It slammed through the clearing so fast it knocked the lantern out of Amos's hand. Fire rolled through the dry grass for a breath, and then the wind shifted again, snuffing it like a candle. But the shed? It didn't even shiver. The boulder drank the blast like it was nothing. It curved it upward, away, around. The men staggered, and frost clinging to their beards, digging tools ripped from their hands. One fell to his knees, gasping, and then the widow opened the door. Inside was orange light, steam, a stillness that made the storm feel like a memory. She didn't invite them in. She didn't have to. They came anyway. 3 days passed before anyone spoke of it again. By then, the town's main well had frozen solid. Mrs. Holcomb's chimney cracked straight through and filled her cabin with smoke. A newborn died 2 farms out because the wind snapped the barn roof, and the mother didn't have the strength to dig through the drift to find help. People began walking through waist-deep snow toward the boulder, not asking anymore, just coming. She never turned anyone away, but she also never explained, not the way she'd known the wind patterns. Not the way the earth beneath that boulder never quite froze, not how her tiny iron stove burned so little fuel for so much warmth. They made guesses. She must have seen the way snow avoided that rock last year. She probably spent months out there studying. Maybe it's just dumb luck, and she happened to be the only one stubborn enough to build there. Wes, once her loudest critic, now simply said, "She listened to the land more than she listened to any of us." Spring came late, the freeze held until April. The valley's river didn't fully thaw until May. But when the thaw did come, and the snows finally retreated from the cabins like soldiers defeated, the damage became clearer. Half the houses would need rebuilding. 3 families moved east, and the widow, she dug a small channel beside the boulder, lining it with stone and clay. Let meltwater trickle along it toward a sunken barrel. She was preparing again for next year, because she knew something most hadn't yet learned. The wind would always return, but so would she. By the time summer warmed the highlands, her shed had become something else entirely, expanded, dug further inward, roof rebuilt from thicker logs, half buried now under turf and sod, so the grass would grow across it like skin. Children played atop it, thinking it a strange green hill. But when autumn came, the smoke returned from its chimney, and once again the wind began to circle, but never touch. People still whispered. They always would. Some said she was a witch, others called her a genius. But one thing was certain. When the wind came again, everyone watched the boulder, and the door tucked safely behind it. The year after, the great freeze was one of ruin and rebuilding. Axe blades rang out across the valley like bells of penance. Men pulled warped boards off roofs, dug out soggy foundations, and cursed at broken fences they no longer had the strength to fix. Sawmills echoed with desperate labor, not ambition. The logs hauled down from the ridge were no longer for new homes. They were for patches, for survival. And in the shadow of the great boulder, the widow's shed stood quiet. No repairs, no boards replaced, no frost scars, not a single crack in the walls. Some men would have taken that as a sign to learn, but too many took it as a mark against them. Like her survival had humiliated the entire valley, and a few weren't done humiliating her back. The widow's name was Ruth Delling. Most didn't know it, or chose not to. She'd come west with her husband, Jonathan, and their infant boy 9 years prior, in a wagon barely holding together by the time it reached the valley trail. She was born in Missouri, they said, or maybe Illinois. Stories changed depending on who was telling them. All anyone knew for sure was that 3 years ago, her husband died in the river trying to clear a jam during a spring flood, left her with 2 children, and a half-finished cabin she refused to live in once he was gone. Some claimed she was touched by grief, by madness. She dug that hole to escape the world, they whispered, and then, somehow the world followed her in. But what she'd really done, quietly, precisely, was watch and learn, and remember what the land did to those who didn't listen. The first who tried to mimic her fully was Everett Lane, a stocky man with hands thick from rope work and a beard grayer than his years. He wasn't proud. He came to her with a map sketched on rawhide and asked for help. She said nothing, just walked with him to his land, stood in silence for an hour, then pointed once toward a low ridge of broken stones and told him, "Build there." He did. By autumn, Everett had a dug-in shelter with 3 walls of stone, 1 of earth, and a roof packed so tight with sod that moss had begun to grow. It was warm, still, quiet, and it saved his family the next winter. Word spread. Not everyone asked so nicely. Elijah Morrow, tall, always loud, always trying to be first to anything that earned praise, asked her to build his family a shed just like hers, said he'd pay in lumber, or whiskey, or protection. She refused, not because she was cruel, but because Elijah's land lay flat as a plate, nothing to brace against, no natural break in the wind, no listening to the earth, just force and noise. He didn't take it well, called her a thief of knowledge, a woman too proud to be neighborly, said she wanted people to suffer so she could feel superior. His voice echoed through the saloon for 2 weeks. But when the storms came again, Elijah's roof blew straight off into the woods. The children who stayed in the widow's shelter that second winter came back changed, not fearful, not shaken, but calm, like the silence in that place had taught them something no adult sermon ever could. They spoke of how the walls didn't creak, how the light never flickered, how you could hear the snow falling outside like rain on wool, but never feel its cold breath. They said the floor stayed warm even after the fire went out. "They say it's the rock," whispered May Holcomb's daughter to the preacher. "It holds the heat in its bones." The preacher frowned. He asked the widow if he might visit. She said yes. He came at dusk, alone. She let him sit by the fire, didn't offer tea, didn't speak much. After a long silence, the preacher said, "The Lord makes the wind, but you've built a place it cannot touch." She said nothing. He looked at the walls, the curve of them, how they pressed into the slope like they were always meant to be there. "Is it wicked," he asked, "to understand the land better than those around you?" This time she looked at him, and she said, "It's only wicked when they think you shouldn't." Spring came again, and with it, travelers. people passing through who'd heard of the rock, and the woman who defied the blizzards. A man from Dakota Territory offered her coin just to look at the inside of her shelter. She refused. Another from back east claimed he was a professor studying thermal retention in primitive structures. She told him to study his own damn house, but as more arrived, others grew angry. She's sitting on a secret that could help the whole frontier, someone said. She could write a book, said another, or sell plans, make a fortune. She don't care about fortune, Wes Corbin said. She just wants to be left alone. But the valley no longer knew how to do that. One afternoon, Ruth found a man sneaking around the back of her shed. Thin, nervous eyes, carried a notebook. Claimed he was just sketching the curve of the wall for reference. She took the notebook from his hands, flipped it open. Dozens of pages, angles, elevations, notes like thermal loop and wind shear disruption theory. She handed it back without a word and turned away. The man asked, "Don't you want people to understand what you've built?" She paused, then said, "They understand fine. They just don't want to believe I didn't need them to do it." The following winter broke records. They called it the Black December. Winds hit 70 miles an hour on the ridge. 3 cabins caught fire when chimneys failed, and sparks flew into the rafters. The widow's fire burned steady. Children came early that year, whole families bringing bedrolls, sheepish expressions. By now, no one mocked the sod roof or the sunken floor. Even Elijah Morrow's boy came, without his father's permission. Ruth let him in, and when Elijah came thundering through the snow demanding he be let in too, Ruth stood in the doorway and said, "He's safe, that's enough," and closed the door. That night the wind screamed like it had teeth, but inside they sang. Children huddled near the fire, trading stories, the older ones telling the younger that the boulder was a giant turned to stone, that its warmth was a leftover piece of the sun. Ruth didn't correct them. She just kept the fire low, listened, and smiled. Because sometimes warmth wasn't just about the air, it was about not being alone. The valley changed after that, not all at once. Some men still grumbled, still claimed she'd hidden some trick, still insisted it wasn't natural for a place to stay so warm with so little wood. But most stopped talking and started listening. More shelters were dug, not copies but inspired. Hillside homes, half-buried lean-tos, barns sunk below the frost line. And the boulder, it became something of a landmark, not marked on maps, not named officially, but travelers would ask for the place by the rock. It wasn't until the spring thaw of that third year that the valley truly understood what Ruth Delling had built, not because they all finally believed her, but because the wind finally broke something else. A young family had moved in that winter down near the river bend, Silas and Miriam Creel, with their twin daughters and a baby son, fresh from Ohio, still wearing wool not fit for mountain cold, trying to homestead like they'd read about in papers back east. They built fast, too fast. Cabin walls went up in 2 weeks. Silas bragged about it. A man ought to be able to build shelter before his horse eats through a second bale of hay. But the walls were straight, proud, square to the sky. They caught the wind like sails. In December, their roof tore off during a midnight gale, and the snow came in like a wave through the rafters. Silas broke 2 ribs trying to cover the girls with his coat. Miriam ran barefoot through the snow toward the only place she knew the wind had never reached, Ruth's shed. Ruth answered the door without a word, let the family in. She wrapped the baby in a shawl, not minding the dirt or the crying, sat Miriam by the stove with a mug of bone broth she'd been simmering since morning. She never asked for thanks, never asked for anything, but by the time Silas healed and went back to what remained of his cabin, he brought something back with him, a small, hand-carved sign. He staked it just off the trail where the boulder stood like a wall, blackened and still. The sign read, "Shelter." Ruth didn't remove it. She didn't acknowledge it either. But the valley took note. For the first time, someone had named what she'd made. Not shed, not witch hut, not hole in the earth, just shelter. And that word meant something more than warmth. It meant refuge. As summer crept in, more came to her, not out of desperation, but out of respect. A teenage girl named Elsie, one of the Holcomb cousins, spent the summer helping Ruth cut sod and haul rock. She said she wanted to learn how to build a room the wind can't find. Wes Corbin brought his grown sons to help dig a deeper root cellar near her plot, not because she needed it, but because he said, "Any place that's protected what this valley couldn't deserves a bit of muscle." By August, Ruth had helped build 4 other shelters, each slightly different, each adapted to its land, none perfect replicas. She told people she wasn't giving them her shelter. She was helping them build their own. But not everyone wanted to learn. Some still wanted to take, and one of them finally came back with fire in his hand. It happened during a dry spell in September. No rain in weeks. The air turned brittle and yellow. The grass cracked underfoot. Fires had to be watched day and night. Embers could travel for miles. That's when Elijah Morrow came again. He hadn't forgotten the winter she turned him away while his boy slept warm inside. He claimed to be checking the land, but he brought a flask and bad temper. And sometime just after dusk, Someone saw smoke curling near the backside of Ruth's shelter. Someone set fire to the dry brush near the boulder. The flames didn't climb fast. They curled low, crackling, kept low by the rock's windbreak. But that was the danger. No wind to carry it also meant no wind to blow it out. By the time Ruth saw the orange licking up from behind her dug-in stovepipe, it had already surrounded the base of the hill. She didn't panic. She handed her children the water pails without a word, showed them where to throw, unlatched the barrels she'd dug for runoff, and poured what she had into the soil around the doorframe. But it wasn't enough. It would have taken the shelter if Wes hadn't seen the smoke from his ridge and charged down with a bucket train of neighbors behind him. They stomped, they doused, they clawed at dirt until their hands bled. And when the last smoke hissed out and the blackened grass went still, Ruth stood at the edge of the scorched circle, arms crossed, no tears, no thanks, just calm. And behind her the shelter stood untouched. Elijah was gone, disappeared into the hills, maybe to another county, maybe into some gulch he thought no one would search. But everyone knew, even those who didn't want to admit it. And by the next Sunday, the preacher included a sermon titled, "Do Not Set Fire to the Quiet Wisdom of Women." He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The story could have ended there, but Ruth didn't let it. She built a second shelter that fall, not behind her boulder, but near it, lower, wider, designed not just for herself, but for others. She said nothing, posted no sign. But when winter came, and the wind rose again like a beast woken from hibernation, there was room for 5 families that year. Wes and his sons helped dig benches into the earth. The Holcomb girl helped hang burlap partitions between sleeping spaces. Ruth's own children took to cooking over the stone stove like it was a game. And for the first time, when a family left in the spring, they left something behind: firewood, preserved vegetables, woven quilts. They called it the second shelter, but others just started calling it Ruth's gift. No one mocked her anymore, not even in whispers, and when strangers passed through and asked where the town's inn was, people pointed past the post road and said, "We don't have one, but you might find a place to rest near the boulder." Some tried to offer her money. She never took it. One woman left gold coins hidden in a jar under the bench. Ruth returned them the next morning without a word. She wasn't building for wealth. She was building against the wind. It would take years before the valley caught up, before towns elsewhere started sinking their walls, bracing against stone, using the earth as insulation instead of enemy. But when they did, they cited her, not by name, not in print, but by story. "She's the one who knew before we did," they'd say. The one who didn't just survive winter. She understood it. Ruth Delling never gave speeches. She never taught a class. She never left the valley. But for decades after, in the worst storms, when the trees groaned and the skies went black and the wind made even strong men weep in their cabins, our children would say to each other, "Pretend we're at Ruth's shelter. Pretend we're where the wind never finds us." And they would sleep easier, because someone once had built a place the wind could not touch. The last winter Ruth Delling spent behind the boulder was the longest one the valley had known in 40 years. The frost came in October. The thaw didn't finish until June. 6 feet of snow stacked high on rooftops. A man froze solid just yards from his barn, trying to carry a lantern through whiteout. Coyotes crept into town mid-morning, bold and starving. Ice buckled the doors of the church. But the shelters, hers and those she'd helped raise, held. And for the first time, they weren't just a refuge. They were a way of life. No one asked anymore why she'd chosen the boulder. No one joked about the shape of her dug-in walls. The barrel stove, the curtain partitions, the root cellar door inside the main room. They copied her now. They looked for their own boulders, not to hide from the wind, but to understand it, not just for shelter, but for peace. And in that long winter, Ruth's place became something else entirely. A school, an ark, a home, not just for her and her children, but for the entire valley when the snow made the rest of the world disappear. On the night the freeze broke the river, a sound like a gunshot echoed down the mountains. Ice cracked and lifted and split the banks in two. The water rose 6 feet overnight, drowning fence posts and carrying logs off like twigs. It hit the Creel farm first. Their second cabin, built better than their first but not dug in, flooded chest high before the sun rose. Miriam ran barefoot across ice again. Same as 2 winters before, this time dragging her girls on a rope tied around her waist. Ruth met her at the edge of the second shelter with dry blankets already in her arms, as if she'd known. That same week, the old preacher died, fell asleep near the stove in his reading chair, book still on his chest, and never woke. They buried him beside the boulder, not because it was traditional, but because, as Wes said, if there's any place a man could rest warm forever, it's under this rock. They carved no stone, just set a bench nearby. And that winter, children started sitting there after chores, just to watch the light curl out of Ruth's stovepipe like the breath of some sleeping beast. Some began calling it the Heartstone, not because it looked like one, but because it was where warmth came from. Ruth aged slowly. Her hair turned silver, her children grew taller than her, but her work never changed. She repaired the same barrel stove every year, replaced stones in the floor with smoother ones found near the river, reinforced beams with logs soaked in pine pitch, collected kindling months before she needed it. And always, the boulder watched, its face black, angled just enough to block the strongest wind no matter how the weather shifted, like it had been waiting all along for someone like her to build into it. Then came the sickness, a strange cough in early summer, dry and rattling, carried in by a trapper passing through. No fever at first, then all at once. 3 cabins quarantined, 1 child buried in July. The town did what it could. Doctor rode in from 3 valleys over with medicine that barely helped. Ruth boiled herbs, taught others to steep spruce tips, dug drainage trenches where standing water festered. The second shelter became the infirmary. She built a small third structure next to it, lower, dug deeper, for those who were too weak to walk. And when she finally fell ill herself, they carried her there. She refused a bed, sat near the stove instead, watching the coals. They say she smiled just once, when Wes Corbin's son told her his wife had built a boulder shelter even tighter than hers. Smaller stove, dug lower, with a curved roof that held heat like a pocket. She nodded once, then closed her eyes and never opened them again. They didn't bury her near the preacher. They buried her under the shed, behind the boulder. Same place her children were born. Same place she had once carried salvaged wood in the snow while men laughed from their porches. They didn't use a casket. They lined the grave with stone, wrapped her in a quilt, and packed the soil down soft. The wind didn't blow that day. In time, people forgot the details. They forgot how many nails she straightened by hand, how many times she patched her roof in silence, how many winters she spent with a single armload of wood and 2 children pressed to her sides. But they didn't forget the shelter, they didn't forget the boulder, and they didn't forget that someone once had listened to the wind and refused to let it touch her. Years later, when trains finally came to the valley, and a road was cut straight through the trees, and men started talking about telephone wires and coal deliveries, a surveyor stopped at the old homestead site. "What's that odd structure?" he asked, pointing toward the sod-covered roof, half hidden behind a ridge. The rancher beside him, no longer young, boots caked in thawed spring mud, said simply, That's the reason we're all still here," and tipped his hat to the windless sky. The boulder still stands. Even now, years gone, names lost to time, and the cabins all replaced or swallowed by vines. The stone still juts from the earth like a sentinel, with no face and no voice, but with memory buried in its shadow. The old ones say it hasn't shifted in 1,000 years, but something changed around it. The people did. Long after Ruth Delling was gone, travelers would still ask for it. Not by her name, they never knew it, they didn't need to. They called it the windless place. You could ride half a day through sleet and storm, frozen dust caked on your saddle, your horse wheezing through its bit, and the moment you crossed a certain line in the land, the world changed. The air softened, the trees grew still, and the quiet settled over you like a quilt. It was a silence not of death, but of refuge. The shelters she built fell into legend. Children born decades later would hear tales told in a low hush by grandmothers stirring stew over newer stoves. She built it with scrap wood and a broken heart, never raised her voice, but the wind listened to her. She dug into the hill like she was climbing into the earth's arms. They told it with awe, not pity, and every child who heard the stories would, at least once, press their ear to the rock in secret and swear they could feel warmth inside it. Like something still beating, like a home waiting to be built again. Eventually, someone built a plaque, not big, not gaudy, just stone on stone carved with a name barely remembered and a single line beneath it. She built what the world needed and asked nothing in return. It stayed unmarked on maps. No road signs led there. No towns tried to brand it. But still, people came. Young women with calloused hands and plans in their heads. Fathers with children shivering in their arms. Old men looking for the kind of silence they hadn't felt since before the wars. They all came, and they left the same way, changed. One spring morning, nearly 80 years after Ruth's last winter, a girl named Clara, 11 years old, red boots, hair braided by her aunt, stood in the lee of the great black boulder while her mother lit a small fire nearby. Clara pressed her palm against the rock, then whispered, "Why doesn't the wind come here?" Her mother smiled but didn't answer. Instead, she wrapped an arm around her daughter and said, "Because once someone listened harder than it blew." Clara nodded, not because she understood completely, but because some part of her already knew. And even now, when the wind comes howling off the high ridges and the frost creeps deep into the bones of the mountains, there is still one place it never finds. Still one boulder it curves around like a river split by stone. Still one legacy built with hands no one thought would survive a single winter. A legacy dug into the earth not by wealth, nor force, nor pride, but by a widow who wanted her children to sleep warm and who never once waited for permission to build what they needed most.